أهلا بكم مشاهدينا في كل مكان. تغطية حصرية جديدة من تلفزيون اليوم السابع. لعقود طويلة من الزمن كانت الملكة إليزابيث الثانية ملكة المملكة المتحدة وعوالم الكومنولث السابقة اللي توفت عن عمر 96 سنة في سبتمبر الماضي 2022 هي عبارة عن حالة فريدة. وجودها على عرش المملكة المتحدة ل70 سنة في العصر الحديث من سنة 52 وحتى وفاتها في عام 2022. أكيد فترة زمنية طويلة عصرت فيها أحداث كتيرة وفترات متقلبة. الحرب العالمية الثانية، التحول للحرب الباردة، بعدها التحول التكنولوجي المذهل في العالم كله. الأكيد أن الملكة إليزابيث الثانية كانت حالة، كان ليها طقوس عديدة وأسرار أكيد كتيرة. اللي نعرفه قليل جدا عن اللي كان ظاهر للرأي العام. من هنا بدأ زميلنا رامي نوار رحلة سعيه للحصول على لقاء بينفرد بيه كعادته علشان يحاول يوصل لخبايا وأسرار أكتر عن العيلة المالكة والملكة إليزابيث الثانية بالتحديد. عايز أوجه له كل التحية الحقيقة على مجهوده. وبالفعل دور وبحث لغاية لما وصل لمستر تشارلز أنسون، السكرتير الصحفي أو المسؤول الإعلامي السابق للملكة إليزابيث الثانية، اللي خدم الملكة من سنة 90 ل 97. شاهد كتير من الأحداث داخل القصر الملكي زي حليق قلعة وينسر البيت المحبب للملكة وانفصال 3 زيجات ملكية داخل القصر، وكتير من الأحداث هنعرفها منه شخصيا. هنعرف أمور شخصية كتير عن المرأة الأطول عمرا على العرش الملكي البريطاني لأول مرة. أنا مستر أنسون موجود معانا النهارده في تلفزيون اليوم السابع، انفراد جديد بالظهور الأول ليه في وسائل الإعلام العربية والمصرية. Mr. Charles Anson, the Queen's former press secretary, welcome on اليوم7 TV and thank you for being with us.
Delighted to talk to you.
Let's start with your job title, Mr. Anson, the Queen's press secretary. Could you tell us more about it and what were you exactly doing?
Well, I was press secretary to the Queen from 1990 to 1997, so one of the most busy and in some ways more difficult times of the Queen's reign. And my job was to be the spokesman on behalf of the Queen, her role as monarch, as head of the Commonwealth, and as head of state in the United Kingdom as well, of course. And in that role, I spoke and dealt with the media not only about the Queen's programme and her priorities as monarch, but also about the other members of the royal family performing public duties. So, of course, the Prince of Wales, now our King, and other members of the family that support the monarch in the constitutional duties that she has. The period when I was press secretary was a particularly busy one, both in family terms and also the period that I was working in was when the Windsor fire took place. It was when the Queen had her first meeting with Nelson Mandela, the first visit ever by a British monarch to Russia. That was the first time ever that a monarch had gone to Russia. So a very interesting period during which I was spokesman for both the Queen and the other members of the royal family who undertake public duties.
So if we talk about what are the most prominent events that you witnessed during your service with the Queen?
Well, the period of the 1990s saw a number of very important international developments. The Gulf War in the early 1990s, the liberation of Kuwait, the liberation of Nelson Mandela from prison in South Africa, South Africa rejoining the Commonwealth, the Queen being the first British monarch ever to visit Russia. That was very significant in terms of the all of the war. So a bit busy time in terms of the monarchy. Of course, the Queen's role is only a constitutional one. The political role of our relations is undertaken by government, but the Queen, as head of state, obviously represents the United Kingdom all around the world, and especially in the Commonwealth.
You said that working with the Queen wasn't only an honor, but also fun. Why was it fun, Mr. Anson?
I can tell you why it was fun to work for the Queen. Is that when I joined the royal household in 1990, the Queen had already been on the throne for 40 years, so she had been doing her job as monarch and as head of state for 40 years. Very few people in the world perform their duties for that long period, and of course it turned out to be the longest reign of any British monarch in history, so 70 years on the throne. And, therefore, a very experienced monarch that I was dealing with as press secretary, and someone who was very familiar with how the media works, how stories can go well and they can go badly. But what was very good from my point of view, that during a difficult period, 1990 to 97, my boss was a highly experienced operator, politically very astute, but of course neutral in dealings with political questions, but altogether an astute person with a very wide range of knowledge of other leaders in the world. She'd met every American president since Dwight Eisenhower and President Truman. She knew de Gaulle and all his successors in France. And of course, you know, she had met leaders in Egypt and in other parts of the Middle East. So I was dealing with a very experienced monarch. My job as press secretary was to explain and interpret the role of the Queen and why she undertook particular engagements both in Britain and also abroad. But basically, what I was dealing with a very experienced head of state, and that made my job easier in a rather difficult time.
Great. You experienced the Windsor Castle fire in 1992, the Queen's beloved home. Could you tell us more about this fire and what happened exactly?
Well, 1992 came to be known as Annus Horribilis, the terrible year.
Yeah.
And that was not really a reference to the royal family, but more a description that the Queen was giving of a rather difficult time, both economically in Britain and, of course, an uncertain time in international relations. The fall of the Berlin Wall had liberated many countries in Eastern Europe, and therefore, in a positive way, there was an opportunity to improve relations with Eastern Europe. So it was a busy time, and it was a difficult time as well in family terms for the royal family, with the separations of the Prince of Wales and Diana, the separation of the Duke of York,
separations, yes.
So both in family terms and in worldwide terms, there was a lot going on, and therefore, as press secretary, my job was to interpret and explain what the Queen was doing, at the same time as keeping the monarchy out of the day-to-day political debate. It is not the function of our constitutional monarchy for the Queen, or in the case now of the King, to become involved in political matters or to conduct political negotiations. So my role as press secretary was to explain what the Queen and her family did in their public roles to represent Britain around the world, to deal with the Commonwealth, and to foster and strengthen those relationships, and of course to encourage all sorts of different sections of society, projects in the social field and so on, as head of state. So really a role of encouragement, of giving people inspiration to make a better society, but not becoming involved in day-to-day politics. So it was a little bit of a tightrope of a job. Quite often the press secretary of the Queen has been a former diplomat, and I was for 20 years in the Foreign Office, serving in Washington and in Tehran and of course in London. So I think the diplomatic role of the spokesman is significant. And many of my predecessors as press secretary were also diplomats. It became quite natural for that role to be conducted by someone who had diplomatic experience.
Mr. Anson, 1997, the death of Princess Diana. We know that the Queen didn't like Princess Diana very much. How was the relationship between them? How could you describe it?
Well, I would say straight away that the Queen had a very strong sense of family. And that was evident to me in my 7 years as press secretary.
Yeah.
The Queen wished to include members of her family and to discriminate between them. So although there might be difficulties to deal with, there was an open door for members of the royal family to come see the Queen, to talk to her, and to be as frank as they wished for her, to be, and for the Queen to protect those confidences. So I don't think one should confuse difficulties with any kind of sort of sense of personal hostility. I didn't feel that the Queen was anything other than open to her son and Princess Diana to try to be helpful to them in what turned out in the 1990s to be a very difficult period in the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales and other members of her family. And the Queen's role was really to try and be as helpful as possible. She was also very realistic. She knew that, you know, life doesn't go swimmingly the whole time for everybody. You come up against difficulties, but I think the Queen's position was always to try and be fair to members of her family and to be fair both to the wider public as well. So I think that sense of family was as strong for the Queen as her commitment to her constitutional duties, whether it was as head of state of the United Kingdom, or in her role in society, her role in the Commonwealth, was to be encouraging to make a better society, but not to indulge or become involved in the day-to-day political negotiations going on.
So let's talk about the Queen Elizabeth as a person. If I ask you about the Queen's personality in ordinary life, what would you say?
Well, I would say, first of all, that she was brought up from the age of 10 when she first knew that eventually she would become Queen, to take an interest in the development of the United Kingdom and of the Commonwealth, and to represent the country in a fair, neutral and open way. And that she did spectacularly successfully. You saw at the time of the Queen's death and the funeral here at Westminster Abbey, the tributes that came from all around the world, including from Egypt, were so warm about the Queen's experience and sense of fairness and openness to making a better world in a non-political way. And I think she was much admired both in this country but also abroad for the values that she represented, the values of openness, of tolerance, of inclusion of groups of people, and also, of course, encouraging the development of a better society, whether it be medicine, whether it be social relations, whether it be inclusion of people who have been marginalized in any way. Her role was really to make a fairer and better society and to project a set of values of fairness and openness and tolerance, including, of course, tolerance of other religions. That was a very important point for the Queen, and has become an even more important point for our current King, King Charles, who has taken a huge interest in comparative religions and has been a great champion of making sure that people of different religious beliefs are treated fairly and included in a 21st century society.
The Queen lived for about 96 years. So how did she maintain her health, her favorite foods or drinks? Was she doing exercises? Tell us more about her life.
I think, Ahmed, the most important thing about the Queen's health is that she was a very straightforward person in the way that she dealt with people. So she had a very calm temperament. and I think that is an enormous help in that public role. And she very rarely got upset about anything. She didn't like it if one of her horses didn't win the race, that's for sure, at Epsom or at the Derby. But in terms of dealing with people, there was this sense of fairness, there was the great experience, and of course seeing people in a public role that she had for 70 years and 40 years by the time I joined the royal household, she had a great understanding of people. She understood how things went wrong. She understood contradiction. And her role was really to try and deal as fairly and as openly as possible. And I think her health benefited from her temperament. In terms of sort of physical health, the Queen loved riding. She liked to ride a horse, and indeed went on riding well into her 90s. I mean, mainly walking and so on horseback, quite gentle riding. But she rode all her life. She went walking in the Highlands of Scotland or at Sandringham, indeed at Windsor Castle as well. So it was a very open-air life that she liked to lead, and even with all her official duties, there was always time for the countryside.
How was she dealing with crisis? Was it reflected in the life of the palace or the royal family?
Yes, I mean, I think my experience in those 7 years, I probably the most difficult time of the Queen's reign. Whenever I went to see her on some problem that was really rather difficult to deal with, maybe an aspect of royal family life or a crisis that she had to deal with in terms of something like the tragedy of 9/11, of communicating with the President of the United States, you know, it was always a very fair and positive way in which she dealt with both bad news and good news. She treated bad news and good news the same way. I mean, just took an interest and looked for the area where encouragement could be given, but always stopping short of becoming involved in the political aspects of resolving problems. That was something for government. But I think her temperament was a very good one for someone in that position in a very busy and unpredictable life of the late 20th century, early 21st century. I think her natural temperament was the strongest aspect of her health.
Who was the closest or beloved to her among her children or grandchildren?
You know what? I mean, I didn't sense any.
No, you have to tell us names.
The Queen, I think, wanted to include all members of her family, and she didn't. She did not have favorites. I really did feel that whenever dealing with her on royal family matters, she treated members of her family the same. I mean, clearly she sometimes had to make decisions that perhaps members of the royal family didn't like, but she always tried to be fair, and there was a sense of fairness about her. So I don't think she didn't have favorites. Former kings and queens have had favorites in previous centuries, but I felt with the Queen, whether she was dealing with her own family, with politicians, whether they were Conservative prime ministers or Labour Party prime ministers, didn't make the slightest difference to the Queen. They were a prime minister, and she dealt with them whatever party they came from, whatever views they held. She dealt with them in the same sort of fair way. And the same went for religion as well. She liked to include in the Commonwealth services at Westminster Abbey the heads of other faiths, the Muslim faith, the Buddhists, and the Catholics, and many others. So I think that sense of fairness goes with a modern constitutional monarchy, and I think the Queen was very successful in keeping out of controversial political debate.
Let me ask specifically about her grandchildren. Who was the most related to her from her grandchildren, Prince William or Prince Harry?
She didn't have favorites. I know you want me to to give you some favorites. But if you were to ask me what particular food the Queen liked, I would say that she's very open to eating whatever is served. Because to have a reputation where people think you don't like this or don't like that makes life much more difficult, and therefore it's easier to not to sort of have favorites, whether it's with food or television programs or whatever else. People always used to ask me, what does the Queen like to watch on television? It was very clear guidance that the Queen did not wish to discuss, which program she particularly liked, because of course by liking some it kind of implied that she didn't like others. And if you're a constitutional monarch above politics, it's different if you're President of the United States or President of France and you have a political role as well as a constitutional one. But in our monarchy, it's entirely a constitutional role. So expressing preferences, I like this Prime Minister, but I don't like that Prime Minister, just makes life very difficult for a constitutional monarch. Therefore, it is better to stay as neutral as possible. And that's, in a way, one of the reasons I think that the Queen was much admired around the world, that she could take an interest in, say, interracial relationships in the Commonwealth by wanting to make a more inclusive society. She naturally wanted to include people, and therefore that sense of fairness meant that she didn't have favorites. And the same went for food or anything like that. You start having preferences, and then everyone gets a bit jumpy about what they give to the Queen because they think she might not like it. That's not the way the Queen worked. She was quite happy to be as open and inclusive as possible, and that makes life easier. Some people just say, well, what colour dress does the Queen like to wear? If you say she only likes green, but she doesn't like red, what does it feel like if you're, a guest at the Buckingham Palace and you turn up in a colour that someone then tells you the Queen doesn't like that colour? It's much easier to be inclusive and not to say, I like this and I don't like that. I mean, I think that's the value of a constitutional monarchy, that she was able to operate in a sensitive and worthwhile way without necessarily always forming opinions, so that she was able to be inclusive and therefore to be respected sort of widely around the world.
How was the Queen's relationship with her husband, and what were the most prominent differences between them?
Well, I think the point there about the Queen is like many successful marriages, there was a contrast of character, contrast of personality, contrast of skills. So the Queen, by nature, rather like her father and her grandfather, George VI and George V, is quite shy by nature, therefore quite reserved in some ways. And that's quite helpful in a constitutional monarch because you get into less sort of arguments if you try and treat people fairly. Prince Philip had a different background. He'd grown up originally in Greece and had been schooled in both on the continent and here in the United Kingdom at Gordonston. And being a sailor, he was a naval officer and naturally was much more sort of open and gregarious. And I think that combination of the Queen's sense of reserve, being above the fray, and Prince Philip's ability to engage in constructive argument about the way society is organized, about the way industry is developing, about how the armed forces are operating. He was able to speak in a more open way because he wasn't a constitutional sovereign himself. He was the husband of the Queen and an absolutely key person in the functioning of the monarchy. I think it would have been a lot more difficult for the to have reigned so spectacularly without the support of Prince Philip. And the Queen described, if you look at the golden wedding anniversary, the speech that the Queen made, she made a point in that speech of 50 years of her marriage to Prince Philip of saying, he has been my support and stay all these years. And it was clear that that support was extremely important. And I saw it a lot as press secretary. I accompanied the Queen and Prince Philip on many of their visits in the United Kingdom, and of course all their visits to foreign countries. And the formality of the Queen in going to a crowded room where everyone felt silent, or going onto the factory floor of some huge business in the United States or Egypt or wherever it may be. Prince Philip was able to sort of talk to people on the ground floor level, ask them, well, how does this machine work, and how do you deal with this group of work? He could make those sort of conversations work very well. And I think accompanying the Queen, he had a different role. It was a very supportive one. Often he broke the ice and made the atmosphere more light-hearted. He had a very good sense of humour. And so I think breaking the ice, making conversation easier, Prince Philip had a very nice way of doing it, and that was a huge support. And I think over those many long years of the reign, that teamwork is very important. I saw it a lot on walkabouts, in big crowds. The Queen's approach to people was rather quieter than Prince Philip's, but the combination worked extremely well.
Mr. Anson, finally, let me ask you, how do you see Prince Harry's new book, Spare?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I think that the succession of Prince Charles to become King Charles has made a very good start. The fact that he's been 50 years as Prince of Wales in public service means that he's extremely experienced in coming to the throne. So I think in terms of continuity, that is a very good thing. Of course, it is a family as well as an institution, the British royal family. So, of course, people take an interest in children growing up and what the relationships should be. And at the moment, obviously, there is a slightly difficult relationship in terms of the younger members of the royal family. But I think, the wish of the king will be to be as helpful as he can to both his sons, and obviously to encourage a workable relationship between people. And I can't really talk about the book of Prince Harry, because it's really those sort of family matters don't come within the role of the press secretary. And even though I'm no longer press secretary, Buckingham Palace has made it absolutely clear that they are not going to comment at all on Prince Harry's book, because mainly it's about relationships within the family. And if you start talking endlessly about relationships within a family, it's not really very helpful to how people get on with each other. But more importantly, it's not part of my formal role when I was press secretary to speak about the more private matters that all of us, you and me, are able to have sort of private lives, and people respect that. And there has to be a dividing line between what is family matter and also, the more public aspects of the monarchy, the marriage of young members of the royal family, so on and so forth. A lot of that is in the public domain, but the actual family relationships, I'm afraid I can't really help on. The palace is absolutely silent about the book, and as I'm a former member of the royal household, I feel I need to follow that same advice. But I sense that in Prince William and in the King Charles, that they would like to see, a happy outcome to whatever difficulties they may have privately. And I like to try and stay out of those particular arguments myself.
At the end, Mr. Anson, we are glad you're with us. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure talking to you. And I look forward to visiting your country again.
We are looking forward, Mr. Anson. Thank you very much, and we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
مرة تانية بكرر شكري لمستر تشارلز أنسون، السكرتير الصحفي أو المسؤول الإعلامي السابق للملكة إليزابيث الثانية، واللي خدم الملكة من سنة 90 ل 97، وكان موجود معانا في انفراد حصري وجديد لتلفزيون اليوم السابع. بشكر زميلي رامي نوار على جهد المعتاد الحقيقة، انتظروا منه انفرادات أكتر الفترة القادمة. بشكركم شكرا جزيلا، كنت معاكم أنا أحمد العدل، وإلى اللقاء.